Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me as ever, I'm delighted to say, is Dario Lalares. Hello, Dario.
Hello, Neil. It's really good to speak to you, and really good to speak to you at the end of what's been a trying week. How's it been for you? I know you've been marking.
Yeah, trying is the right word. It's I'm off on annual leave in about 2 hours after recording this, so I'm kind of right at the end of my tether and physical capacity for it. Yeah, it's been a really tough term, essentially a third term sort of tacked on the end. Just been marking and finishing that off today, and then getting ready to kind of sign off for a couple of weeks. I am ready for it, and you seem to be similarly run through the ringer.
Yeah, I mean, we had a 3.5 hour Zoom meeting yesterday, and it just sort of brought home to me how inefficient a lot of the organizational structures we have are. And I'm not just talking about our place, I mean just sort of generally in the way that we work. And it's funny how this has sort of laid that bare. But then this morning I was still really, really tired, and I think this was the first time that I thought sort of staring at Zoom has really hit me in that way, and I found it really hard to sort of concentrate this morning, and I was sort of doing bits and pieces of easy stuff. But then also on the email I could tell the sort of real, I think, sort of tetchiness and tiredness in people's lives, quite rightly. And you could sort of feel it in the air that people were just like, can you just understand where we all are right now? And I think it's different organizations have reacted in different ways, but maybe there still is a lack of awareness of just how difficult, and I mean this unprecedented semester of work in the university sector, but just generally how tough people are finding it.
Yeah, completely agree with that. I think it's made doubly hard by the fact that, I know certainly my institution, there is an absolute lack of humanity regarding what's happened in the world, and this sense that we should just be kind of carrying on as normal and doing more, essentially, because we're at home, and we shouldn't be needing breaks because we've been at home for 3 months. And it's all in subtext, and it's all in this kind of constant stream of you need to do this and you need to do this, you need to do this. And yeah, it just feels really isolating. And it's not I don't think it is a woe is us kind of in this sector. I think we are working extremely hard, like so many people are, but also I think, and we've talked about this a lot, that there's two responses. There's the human, okay, what can we change? What can we do differently? How can we not continue this stream of just making people miserable and exhausted and burnt out and signed off with stress and anxiety and depression, and it's been rife in the sector from students and staff for the last few years. Or there's just this doubling down, and I'm in an organisation which is doubling down, and we had a week of training the other week, sort of online, all day, every day, watching screens, being told, do this, be innovative by September kind of thing. And just no sense of well-being at all. And then at the end of the week, there was an hour devoted to it, and there was over 200 people on a Teams call, and they're all saying the same thing. Like, we are exhausted, we are miserable, we don't know what we're doing, there's no support, we can't have a break, and it's really, really, it's really impacting people's lives in a really serious way, and I feel very fortunate with my home situation, but there's a lot of days where at the end of it, I'm absolutely shattered from just the kind of the overwhelming demand on my time, and I don't see any change or any let up, and that's just, oh my God, that makes me feel really miserable. And I haven't even had my exam boards yet. I've got 2 in the next couple of weeks as external examiner, and you just know it's the same in most places, which is just so sad. Yeah,
and I think just on the screens thing as well, I've been really making a priority of sort of getting outside and trying to do exercise, because I'm finding that is the only way now that I'm able to sort of shift my brain into a different gear and gain some kind of relaxation. Because if I'm just sitting at home, I find it really difficult to do. So whether I've just bought a second-hand bike and refurbed it, so sort of getting out on that has been nice, and I'm managing to play tennis now that they've opened that up again. All right, all middle-class stuff, but it's kind of like I find it really hard to sort of sit on the sofa and or just sort of get into a meditative space at home, and even sort of watching films has become kind of difficult. Although I think over the last few weeks I've kind of managed to put myself into the space by turning everything else off and just concentrating on the film and watching it as a film, not watching it as something that needs to be studied. Or even for the podcast, I've sort of tried to say, no, yeah, all right, you can talk about this on the podcast, but just enjoy the film and see where it goes. You know what I mean? And that's I've been consciously trying to do that.
Yeah, and you've got a few interesting titles to chat about. Yeah,
it's really interesting at the moment, I think, to sort of see new stuff, obviously in the light of what has happened over the past few months and the whole sort of structure of film watching in terms of, releases and, what's in the box office top 10. All of that is just sort of completely off my radar now. So it's funny how our podcast, I think, seems to fit the times, because we're interested in new stuff that maybe people wouldn't ordinarily see, and then obviously doing rewatches of stuff that maybe we haven't seen but we have seen before as well. And those of you who are Patreon subscribers, I'll write a little bit more about this in the newsletters, but The Last Black Man in San Francisco was a film that I was trying to catch up with big time, and I absolutely loved that. And it just sits with what's been going on really clearly, I think, but also is a really entertaining and a film that is full of life and full of interest. And then I watched this directorial debut on Amazon Prime called The Vast of Night, and that absolutely blew me away, simply because it just fits in beautifully to a lot of the interests that I have right now with film sound. And on the surface, it's very much a sort of nostalgia-laden sci-fi, but the director really has found a way to sort of play around with that, or draw attention to what he's doing with our love of sort of 50s, 60s Cold War sci-fi and the analog technologies around that, and particularly in terms of the way it tells the story through the use of sound. I found absolutely fascinating, and I'm definitely sort of going to give that a rewatch with a more of a kind of academic reading in mind.
Great, yeah, I saw that the other day. I read Mark Commode's review of it in The Observer, and what's been really great is that because of the change in distribution of the last few months and fewer big tentpole films and kind of big, even high-profile indie films, the pages in the press have been given over to smaller releases. And there was a big review of The Vast of Night in The Observer, and a really nice review from Mark, and that switched me onto it. And it was one of those things that I'd seen it on Amazon Prime, when it came up, and just the look of it, because I hadn't heard of it, I was like, not sure. And then I read the review and I was like, actually, I'll give that a go. And yeah, same as you, I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and a great example of an indie which leans into limitations of budget and scope in such an imaginative way that you don't even think that it's a compromise, and it's not. It's an artistic choice which works really well, and it's absolutely, kind of gripping, and great performances from the actors. Really kind of nails, that kind of tone and that kind of throwback, but also understands the way that the 50s B movies and kind of the 80s cycle of homages were aware that what's being suggested as out there is ever shifting and kind of can play at any time. And it really speaks to a lot of the current moment as well, in terms of kind of particularly small town and rural and kind of the idea of the other and what's out there. And there's a lovely moment with with audio, which also speaks to the stuff you're talking about in the last Black Man in San Francisco as well. So yeah, really, really great movie. I look forward to hearing your sort of more detailed thoughts on that when you write something. What else have you been catching?
Well, interestingly, the other day I started watching A Personal History of David Copperfield, and I was watching it with our girlfriend, and we were looking for sort of Friday, Saturday night entertainment. And I have to admit, God, it really didn't work for me at all. I mean, again, and when I say that, not this is a bad movie, it's like it just didn't work for me. I found it really sort of BBC Sunday afternoon twee, and I was sort of pretty disappointed, considering how much we watched the entirety of The Thick of It and In the Loop, and I love Iannucci, but yeah, this was just pretty tame, I thought. And actually, in some ways, did that thing that I hate Slumdog Millionaire for, which is almost sort of poverty porn or making light of. I mean, I know it's supposed to be an entertaining thing, don't get me wrong, but anyway, it just didn't work for me. So we quickly got on, so we need to find something fast, and we know we're going to enjoy it. I said, you know what, I haven't seen it, and it popped up on the streaming list. I haven't seen Interview with a Vampire for a long time, and me, I'll watch Tom Cruise pretty much in anything, and I just think he's a really interesting, the most interesting movie star of the last sort of 30, 40 years for many, many reasons, good and bad. And obviously Brad Pitt's in it, and Antonio Banderas is great as well. And God, that movie, we really enjoyed it. I mean, it really, really sort of worked on a Saturday night. This is proper film star movie stuff. And interestingly enough, because we'd watched that, then a few days later we watched The Lost Boys, and of course what happened with Joel Schumacher sadly passed away. And I think it's interesting how seeing both these films quite close together. They are very different movies, but they're very similar in lots of ways as well. It's almost as if The Lost Boys is a sort of 14-year-old's version of what The Interview with the Vampire, maybe a sort of 30-year-old would, the same director might make that, 20 years later or whatever. So it's really interesting how they've both got that sensibility from the sort of, what is it? Lost Boys, I think, is early 90s. They've both got that kind of 90s aesthetic, I think, and a really interesting double bill, considering how many films today are, obsessed with vampires and fantasy monsters of that kind.
But both films really put the kind of the homoeroticism of the vampire sort of lore. I remember being at university and we are doing the horror module, and someone did a presentation on the kind of the homoerotic or the homosexual undertones of the Lost Boys, and kind of it was really interesting being in a room of people who'd obviously seen the Lost Boys and thought it was a great romp, and then someone really articulately kind of doing a kind of close reading of the kind of the signifiers in the film, and obviously talking about Schumacher as a kind of homosexual filmmaker, and just people going, what, it's a queer movie? And it's like, yeah. And then when one of those things where someone does it and you can't see the film in the same way ever again, it's like, it's so obvious once it's been kind of read in that way. And yeah, always loved that movie, and yeah, I always had a soft spot for Interview with the Vampire. I remember when it came out, and it was one of those films that happens in Cruise's career, isn't it, where he's doing something people are like, this seems like a strange choice. And I haven't seen it in a long time, but I remember at the time thinking, like, it's so interesting to see an actor like that doing work like that. And he's a smart actor. He knows how that's going to be read, and while he may have kind of skirted around some of the more kind of, sort of explicit things in the kind of the core text, there's no avoiding what's going on in the movie. And I think he really is kind of on board with that, which I think makes it a really fascinating film.
Yeah, absolutely. So what else have you been seeing?
Well, I got sent some stuff to kind of to mention, which has been really nice, and a kind of mixed bag. A Foreign Affair. So Masters of Cinema sent me Foreign Affair, which is the Billy Wilder's post-war German-based comedy drama with Marlene Dietrich, and that's just, a really underrated Wilder, which everyone should see. They also sent me, I didn't even ask for this one, they sent me a film called Mr. Vampire, which actually just, is very much in line with your kind of 80s and 90s vampire movie. It's a Hong Kong action movie with kind of undead storyline. And yeah, it was just a lot of fun. It's really great set pieces, sort of set in a mortuary, and kind of cursed undead vampire comes back, and yeah, just I've never heard of it, I've never seen anything about it, but it's a really fun movie, well worth checking out. But the best thing they sent me was Robert Siodmak's Crisscross with Burt Lancaster and Yvonne De Carlo, which is an absolutely brilliant noir or noir adjacent LA movie. Really, really tough movie. Burt Lancaster comes back to LA. He sort of fled because of this kind of tortured romance with Yvonne De Carlo, and comes back vowing to be a better man and just can't resist, and then picks up this heist from the place he works. He works for a kind of bullion van, and just gets kind of caught up with Yvonne De Carlo's new husband, who's a kind of gangster. It's just really, really tough and gritty, and just has maybe one of the bleakest endings of any kind of noir, but a really, really beautiful transfer, and just a thrilling B movie, which is absolutely fantastic. The BFI released Little Joe, which is Jessica Hauser's film about plants, which weird you sort of talking about kind of watching stuff in the moment that we're in. And this is a film where most of the cast spend most of the film in face masks and gloves and disinfecting, which it's just a weird sensation watching stuff like that, knowing that's going to be the kind of the everyday aesthetic for how long, who knows. It's really interesting the way it kind of speaks in a kind of practical way to now. But and I really wanted to see it because I saw Lords recently on Mubi and just thought it was amazing. And this isn't quite up there, but I really, really enjoyed it. Again, it's just a really slow burn, interesting psychological drama where the premise is that this plant that they're kind of genetically creating gives off a scent which changes people in a way that it can't be traced. They're the same, but they're not the same, and there's no physical or anything changed. It's just you just know and feel it's different, which is so hard to convey on film, but for the most part kind of manages really well. What kind of lost it for me is I just felt there was a real misstep right at the end, which kind of undid a lot of good work, but looks beautiful. And yeah, she's a filmmaker that's kind of really interesting. And then the last thing was Fanny Lye Delivered. We sort of asked to look at that, which is this origin story of Fanny Lye, a kind of famous kind of Quaker figure. And it's starring Maxine Peake, who's obviously been in the news for...
Yeah, I've seen this pop up, and you sent it to me, but I haven't got a chance to watch it yet.
It's an interesting movie. It's weird because I'm reading Adam Scovell's book on folk horror and just sort of the chapter about kind of the 70s and 80s British television, like the M.R. James adaptations and sort of Quatermass and things like that. And it feels much more closely aligned to that than kind of contemporary British folk horror. And it's one of those films that it kind of lives and dies by its performances. You know, it's set in sort of the early 18th century and sort of late 17th century, I think. And Maxine Peake's very good as kind of Fanny Lye, watching this kind of figure be awakened. Charles Dancer's the kind of puritanical husband, and then there's a young couple that sort of come into the homestead and sort of change everything. But Freddie Fox plays this kind of supposedly charismatic new age preacher kind of figure. He just doesn't convince. You know, some actors can play in the past and some can't. And for me, that casting just didn't work enough to make the film work. And also, it's interesting because you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to show where a strong female legendary character comes from, but the problem with that is that journey is ultimately one where they face such brutality and that if that's what you're showing, Maxine Peake doesn't really get the chance to do anything other than witness, and then at the end of the film say, I've had enough of this, I'm going to be something else. Do you know what I mean? So there's definitely enough there in it that I'm interested in what the filmmaker does next. But and you know, Maxine Peake and Charles Dance are always very, very good. So it has its moments, but yeah, didn't quite do it for me. I think similar to David Copperfield for you, it just felt like I could see things that were attempted but didn't quite work.
Great, but some good stuff there. That noir definitely sounds like something I would want to.
It's absolutely brilliant, sure. Absolutely brilliant movie.
Cool. So let's move on to the main crux of today's podcast. So this is an interview that I did with the film editor Katie Bryer, and we recorded this a little while ago. Now I think it was sort of just as the lockdown was really kicking in, and I got in contact with her on Twitter after seeing Bruce Lee and the Outlaw, which was this really sort of bleak, dark documentary filmed in Bucharest in Romania, and depicted these street kids who were all sort of trying to survive, and how they all sort of coalesced around this really eccentric and even, you know, charismatic kind of criminal street figure who called himself Bruce Lee. And yeah, it was really interesting to sort of chat to Katie, because she'd also done Maiden, which I subsequently watched, which was the film about the first female crew of the Whitbread Round the World yacht race. And again, that was a really interesting piece from an editing perspective. And she'd also done the Netflix TV series Virunga, which had done very, very well and, you know, won awards and actually had been quite politically significant. So it was really interesting to speak to her, and also, you know, thinking about doing an episode on editing itself, Neil. It's one of those things I think that probably, you know, doesn't come to the foreground when people think of the filmmaking process. But, you know, as we know, editing and sound, if you get those wrong, you haven't really got a movie. And I think, you know, we talk a little bit in the interview about the idea of the film being made in the edit, and some of the things that Katie talks about are related to sort of learning craft and learning, you know, some moving beyond just pushing buttons and learning how to edit. I mean, have you got any thoughts yourself on sort of how we talk about editing really in terms of the cinematic process?
Yeah, I don't think we talk about it enough. just with other aspects of kind of filmmaking, and reducing filmmaking to directing, again, is kind of limits the way of seeing, really. And I think what I'll say at the start is one of the things that comes up a lot is when people sort of say, oh, that film was too long. And for me, that always says, well, where's the fault in that? It might be in the script, but often it's in the editing, and often it's in not having a strong enough editor, or a good relationship between a director and an editor to know when something is not right. Because, if a film is well edited, it feels exactly as long as it should. Like it just feels like that's the right length and that's the right structure for that. And much of that is in the editing. And, there are numerous examples of kind of directors taking over edits, and the auteur idea winning the day, but the result is not the best result. And for personally, look at something like Apocalypse Now, and for me, the first cut is the best cut. That there's what gets put in and added just kind of weighs it down and creates a baggage. And I just think it's much, much tighter without all that stuff, which are kind of a number of decisions have gone into that edit rather than just the editors. But I think that I also don't like this idea that, that people sort of say, oh, you shouldn't see if, editing should be invisible. And I think that, like anything, that's a really narrow way of thinking about it. Sometimes, yes, it should be, you shouldn't be aware of how you're being moved through a story. But certainly sometimes I want to feel like I'm watching something where there's a kind of a real design to the way those images are put together. Think of something like, the work of Nicholas Roeg, Don't Look Now in particular. Like, you feel the editing in that movie for the purpose of the storytelling. And again, it's like we always say on this podcast, it's not one thing, and it has to be kind of considered in a broad way. And it's really nice to have an episode with an editor talking about their craft, to be able to kind of get into a bit, definitely.
Cool. So let's do that now. This is my chat with the editor, Katie Bryer. So, Katie, how's lockdown treating you? I mean, obviously, spending all your life in editing booths, it must be quite similar to the situation we've found ourselves in now.
It's been really interesting observing how the editing process in lockdown and what I love about editing, because when I came home with the kit, I thought it would actually work pretty much the same as it does in an edit suite. And I like working on my own for long periods of time and then having a discussion with the director. That's the way I like working. And so I thought we could still work like that. But actually what I really miss is that collaboration with the director where you're with each other and you're bouncing ideas off each other. And that's when magic happens, and it's not necessarily all verbal, and you're matching each other's energy and you're getting excited about things. And I really miss that. And we try on the phone, or on Zoom, but it's not the same.
Yeah, we've had to kind of get used to that on the podcast because Neil, who I do it with, he lives, a different part of the country. So we always have to do it remotely and then edit on the back end. But it's funny, whenever we're going to go and meet up, there is always this sort of new sense of excitement. Oh, we're actually in the room. It's going to happen how it's supposed to happen. So, yeah, I suppose, with the director-editor relationship, you must have to do a bit of editing, then go back and talk about it, then do a bit more and then go back. It must be quite time-consuming that way.
Yes, and if you're in the edit suite together, or in the same building even, you can have an idea and discuss it instantly, and they might be tiny little ideas throughout the day or moments, and at the moment I'm saving those up for one call, and it's not the same. It doesn't have that flow, but we're getting more and more used to it, I think, and this may be how we have to work for a long time.
Yeah, and with the whole situation going on right now, obviously sort of productions have shut down, whether it's film or television. So do you have quite a bit of backlog of projects to be working on?
Yeah, I'm really lucky that I do have 3 projects back to back that had already been shot, although we're waiting for pickups for 2 of them. But I know a lot of people in drama who, it's going to be really tough for them. I think they still don't know how it's going to pan out.
Yeah.
I'm sure this will have an effect on my work in the, possibly next year it'll have a knock-on effect. But at the moment, I'm very lucky. But it does mean I'll still have to work from home for a while, I imagine.
Yeah, and I suppose though with editing, it's one of those roles that even if productions transfer into kind of like more experimental or weird home shooting or whatever it might be, they're still going to need editing, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's really exciting. I think it's going to test people's creativity a lot.
And I definitely want to come on to talking about things like shooting on different types of camera and using different aspect ratios, because it's very clear that that's part of a lot of your work actually. And when we talk about Maiden and Bruce Lee and the Outlaw, which is the first film of yours that I saw, the one I kind of commented on online, which led to this conversation. But just take us back to your sort of training. Were you always, did you go to film school? Were you always sort of interested in the role of editor? Was that the thing that sort of sparked your imagination when you first started?
Well, no. So I was always, I guess, when as a teenager and a child, I wanted to make films. I didn't know what that meant. Write or direct. I did used to write quite a bit. Tell stories. I didn't discover the edit suite for a very long time, and I was desperately shy, so directing was something I secretly wanted to do, but the thought of I did actually direct a short film in my late 20s, but up until that point I couldn't find a way in, so I did manage to get A-levels and got to university to do film, which was an academic degree at University of Kent.
Oh, right.
We did make some films, but usually I was assisting other people making films, more confident people than me. And then I discovered, as part of that extracurricular stuff, I discovered the Edit Suite, which suited my personality at the time because I could sit in there and didn't have to interact too much with people, but also tell stories, and actually realised that it was a brilliant way of telling stories. And I had this tool and it was like writing. And I always think, I read somewhere, I can't remember who said this, that the story is like a baton that is handed from the writer to the director to the editor.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. So it passes through these different stages. And then I was lucky enough to get on a traineeship at the National Film and Television School in the edit department, which was they did it for 2 years, I think. It was for people straight out of uni. So it was for younger people. In the past, they'd had people who'd worked in the industry for a long time. And it was brilliant. I met so many incredible people, interesting people. I moved to London. It was an eye-opener. But I was still very uncomfortable talking about film, very uncomfortable going out of my way. It was still, I was building up my confidence very, very slowly.
And did you learn at NFTS sort of, through the sort of practice-based learning? Or was there quite a bit of, we're going to study this person's editing style or something like that?
Not at all, not on the traineeship I was on.
Right.
So I was editing student films, graduation films, but also trying a bit of everything out, which was brilliant for me. So I was helping on all sorts of other people's, we all took it in turns to crew up. So I learned a lot and I met a lot of people, which was vital.
Was there a sort of dearth of editors then? Is that why that traineeship sort of came into being, do you think?
No, I think they were transitioning to what they are now, which is much younger. I think it really was for people who'd been in the industry a long time and wanted to go back and study. So the majority of the students, I was in my 20s, the majority of students were in their 30s, 40s. Yeah, my friends, who are still my friends, were 10 or 20 years older than me. So I think they were trying to move it more. It was an experimental stage.
And then straight out of that, did you get projects to work on? Commercial stuff, work that would actually, sort of give you the career?
No, I was working in short films for ages, which was fun for no money. Still not really learning interestingly not learning. I don't feel like I knew then how to edit. I feel like I was being told what to do,
Right,
and
okay.
I was pushing buttons. Again, a confidence thing. I went into Soho, became a runner, was an assistant for so long.
Right.
Again, watching people move on ahead of me who have more confidence. Editing, using the edit suites after work to do my own things. And just, it was a very, very slow process for me. And then I went into, I worked at the BBC on Holby City as an assistant. And then started assembling for the editors and learned a hell of a lot of very basic stuff of how to cut a scene that had been very blocked out and scripted. But that was great. And then got into kids' TV.
Yeah, I saw that on your profile on IMDb, the sort of animation and also puppet shows and stuff. That must be an interesting thing to edit together.
I always like to think I was, for about a month, I was Britain's top preschool editor. But I loved it and animators I met were just brilliant. And again, had a lot of fun. Lots of storytelling, really being able to craft a very simple story is not that simple. And I learned a lot again, but eventually became frustrated because obviously it was very limited. And finally got into more observational stuff for TV. So working with huge amounts of footage at a very fast turnover, sort of reality TV stuff. And then the big change in my career was going to Grain Media, who were local to me in South London. And that was about a decade ago, which was Orlando von Einzeldel's company and John Drever's at the time. And I just found my home there.
And they were director, producer, company, and doing lots of projects, just for our listeners, yeah.
Very, at the time, very small. John was doing comedy and Orlando was doing documentaries, but they hadn't been going very long. It was a good time to start with them. And Orlando just made Skaterstan, which was a short film about a skating school in Kabul. And and since then I've worked with him and with John on many, many short films and films.
When you're first starting out or you're getting into the sort of BBC projects, is that very much a sense that everything, I mean, you say everything is kind of like blocked out and it literally is, as long as you know how to work the software, everything is planned out for you almost. And is there a moment where, you said that you were kind of like getting a bit frustrated with that. Is there a sort of time where the penny drops and you become a kind of editor rather than just a sort of software operator, as it were?
Well, for me, it was confidence to try things out. I mean, I think that's quite scary to actually step out and say, actually, I want to try something new. So that took me a long time. And getting to know directors and for them to trust you to try different things out. And probably my confidence grew at Grain. Probably that's when I was really learning. And also I was, in the last 10 years, studying story structure, which gave me a bit more confidence.
Sure.
Just reading and watching films, watching documentaries and absorbing stories, reading books. I mean, you're absorbing stories all the time. So I think when you realise your instincts, when you start trusting your instincts about story, that's when you gain confidence. And
then working with the massive amounts of footage, that must be almost a sort of logistical exercise as much as anything else. Sort of organising where stuff goes, but remembering or watching through everything that you've seen and where is it all going to put together. That must be actually a really good sort of school for editing, having so much footage to deal with.
I think it's a few things. I mean, it's tenacity. I don't really let something go, and I have to watch every frame of footage there is, which is probably quite frustrating for producers who want to... Actually, I've been very lucky with the producers, and on Maiden, there was never any pressure for me to, rush things. I watched everything, and things were coming in all the time. And they were brilliant at giving me that space. So it's sorting and taking it in, taking in different themes. At the same time, well, Maiden as an example, I'd already watched the extensive interviews that Alex had done, which were brilliant. So I knew roughly what the story, what I was looking for. So whilst I was going through the archive, I knew what themes to be looking for. What, when you find a moment that one of your contributors has mentioned, it's just, and you never think that you're going to actually see that somebody filmed it. It's very exciting. So I really enjoy going through archive and massive amounts of footage, but it's overwhelming. It can be overwhelming. You just have to do it. Give yourself the space and the time, or be allowed the space and the time, and do it methodically.
So let's talk about Maiden. How did you come to that project? Because obviously this is a project that is an amazing story, and actually, watching it there, you get the sense of the historical importance of it, in many ways. And I actually remember that being on TV, so it was amazing to sort of see all that background footage. But you were working with lots of different types of footage, as you say, so that must have been sort of presented a challenge to navigate the story, as you were talking about.
Well, how I met Alex Holmes, or he had seen Virunga, which I edited with Orlando von Einsdale, with a number of editors that were on that, because it was a massive project that went on for years. He'd seen that and loved it, and he got in touch, and he mentioned Maiden, but this was years before they even had the funding for it, which is extraordinary. But he couldn't. They struggled to get that off the ground, which is amazing, because it's such a bit
like the boat race, really.
It really was, and Tracy was involved too in getting it off the ground. But so yes, and the footage. I mean, my focus is on story, and I think I learned that with Orlando during Virunga, that if the story's good enough in the footage, if the footage looks crap, you have to go with the story. You can't throw things out because they're out of focus if it's a key part of the story. And the same with archive. So there was archive coming in from all over the place, and I don't worry too much about how it's going to look. I mean, that a bit can be done in the online to clean things up, but with a tight budget, there's not much you can do. What's harder actually is bad audio, and that's more problematic. But we've got around that before in films by subtitling things. So if it drives the story along, I say use it. There was one bit in Maiden where I found part of the interview, very high quality, this great interview in New Zealand, and it was only for a news item. And then I found the other half of it on another news item on really poor quality VHS recorded from the TV. We never found it. And we put the two together. And it doesn't matter. You can see that we pulled it from all different places.
And how much do you work with the director, or do you have your part in how long, let's say, or where the cuts happen between the talking heads footage and, say, going back to the raw materials? Because obviously you want those talking heads to to have that sense of memory and giving it a texture of, this is what I felt back then, and giving it a sort of contextualization. But then there are a lot of choices, aren't there, about how long you linger on somebody who's maybe emotional at the time and all that kind of thing. I mean, that's to do, isn't it, with the director editor collaboration, I suppose.
Yeah, and you have lots of, I mean, the ideal way of working is you have lots of discussions throughout so that you're on the same wavelength. And then if there's huge amounts of footage, you can't both sit together and go through everything. So they have to trust you and let you get on with it. And luckily, Alex Holmes did. He'd done these amazing interviews where he'd really taken them back to relive that race. Really extensive interviews, hours and hours. And they were brilliant. They were so candid. So getting that balance between the archive and the, often the women would describe an event so brilliantly that you want to stay on the talking heads. Other times I would find brilliant news footage or footage from the boat. So it actually came pretty easily, the balance.
For me, sailing was about freedom. It was freedom of everything. It was leaving everything behind. My father died when I was 10. My parents instilled in me a sense of determination. So when I heard about the Whitbread Round the World race, it was just something I had to do. Sailing at that time was very male-dominated, and there were just no women anywhere in it.
The Whitbread Round the World race at 33,000 miles is the longest and most challenging on Earth.
I wanted to be part of this. I remember going to the skipper, and he went, "We're not going to be the only racing team in the world with a girl." And that's when I made the decision to put an all-female crew into the race.
In terms of emotion, there's one big discussion with me and Alex, and I've had this with other people before. How often do you show someone crying? For me, and Alex agrees, for me, showing someone preventing themselves from crying is much more moving and emotional than showing someone break down. I think there are times where you show someone break down, and Tracy cries a lot retelling that story. But I think in the film we only show her crying once, maybe twice. So you rein it in, and then when it's appropriate.
What's good about that as well, I think the story that comes out is how it wasn't just kind of like a straightforward against the odds thing. There was a lot of difficulty within the crew, like the moment where she had to fire and fire the other crew member and then like take over. And it's great that you had that interview because it gets both sides of the story. I mean, is it difficult sometimes when almost that you want to, there is a story there to be told, but maybe you haven't got elements of the footage that would furnish both sides in that way?
Yeah. I mean, obviously the early days of Maiden before the race, there was very little footage. So we had to be a bit creative with the archive we had. But I mean, that was down to the crew. What you're talking about, when she had to fire a crew member, they were so open about it. There's so much love between all of them, the crew. But just talking about Tracy totally owns her mistakes, and they were so young. So I think we can all relate to it, which is what you want. I mean, what you're always looking for in documentary and in interviews is something relatable. However difficult, I mean, none of the crew or Tracy were difficult, but in other films I've had difficult protagonists who maybe you don't like, or you don't have to agree with what they've done. But if there's something we can relate to about some humanity, and often these people have told their story so many times before that it's hard to find that humanity and that vulnerability because they're relating a story they've told they're storytelling. So you're searching for those moments of truth, really. Yeah.
Do you think there's been a shift in terms of, I want to call it the kind of the coherence of different types of image? So, I mean, and what I mean by that is, now we're living in an era where everybody's used to seeing different kinds of footage, whether it's phone footage or raw footage or film stuff or talking heads that's been shot very very good lighting and all that kind of thing. I just wondered in your sort of career whether you've seen a change where that becomes more and more accepted or the norm, or actually kind of required to give it a sort of modern authenticity.
Oh, I don't know about required, but yes, it's definitely changed. In fact, the thing I'm working on at the moment, I still haven't worked out a good way of doing this, but often now there are events in our lives that happen on text or on email.
Yeah.
And I find that really difficult. I'm working on something at the moment where there's a whole conversation via text, and how to show that, do you have someone reading them out? That's sort of not what you were asking, but I think yes. And I worry that there's a whole YouTube generation who are used to jump cuts in interviews, which I can't. I mean, I can't bring myself to do that. And I've seen, quite high-end TV docs that have jump cuts in interviews, and I can't.
It's not your thing.
No, and I feel like I need to maybe visually. I need to.
It's a definite aesthetic, isn't it? Because it's kind of like that sense that somebody's being interrogated. It almost comes from the sort of true crime genre, I think. You know what I mean? Where you have to jump through a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily matter. Yeah, exactly.
I'm working on a true crime thing at the moment. That's why.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about these things. Definitely. Yeah.
For sure.
And just going back before Maiden, Virunga, which is this huge project, as you said, for Netflix, which is Oscar nominated, an absolutely massive thing. Was that, I mean, without being sort of cliched about it, was that sort of your big breakthrough? Did you feel like, I'm working on something proper here,
Well, we didn't. I mean, I think that Orlando, it was his first feature, and we were both learning, I think, and I think he'd say that, because it started as a short film and it just kept growing and growing and growing. But it wasn't a Netflix film. So Netflix and Leonardo DiCaprio came on very late in the day when this amazing impact producer called Joanna Natasagara came on board. Yeah. So no, we didn't know. We knew it would. I mean, the story kept getting better and better and better. But it was very difficult. It was a difficult story to tell. Yeah. And there are loads of different editors. We were also trying out different things. There was a whole cut Senna style without, where you don't see the talking heads. And that was really interesting experiment, because it lost a lot of the emotion when you just had voiceover. But it was good to try it out. So, yeah, it was brilliant. And then the whole Oscar journey was just really fun. I've done it all again with Maiden, and it felt very different this time. And with it was just really exciting, and we couldn't quite believe what was going on.
Did you go over there then?
We did. I mean, Orlando and Graham were brilliant in that they we all went over. We didn't go to the Oscars. He went to the Oscars, but we all went to the parties around it, and it was just it was brilliant, and we all felt like a team. But the best part of that whole journey was we all went to Virunga for the Congolese premiere and to show the Rangers the film, which was one of the most moving nights of my life. We showed them outdoors on a big, we projected it with the volcano in the background glowing. Wow. And it's just the most incredible place on earth.
Fantastic. And then soon after that, though, you I mean, it must be interesting because you are, you've done a lot of what you broadly sort of call natural history documentaries, but with a story at the centre of them. But then you edit this film called Super Bob, which is a sort of low budget absurdist British comedy. What's the difference then? How do you come to that? Is there can you tell very clearly that there is a sort of documentary style and then a fictional style of editing?
No, not at all. I mean, I just like editing stories, and one's scripted and one's not. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a lot of Super Bob wasn't scripted. It was improvisation. So no, I'm just amazingly not that much difference. I find scripted stuff easier in many respects because it's not such a daunting task. You've got far less rushes. But then if something's not working, if there was something wrong with at script stage, it's very hard to get out of that. Whereas in documentary, you have multiple ways of getting out of a knotty situation.
Yeah. So is it true then, that mythology that people say, that films are found in the edit a lot of the time?
Oh, God. Well, God, in documentary, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, they are. I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of, Joost van der Broek. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Maybe I shouldn't.
No, it's fine. Go for it.
Joost, who was a photographer, a street photographer, and he was taking photos of these street kids in Bucharest and started filming them, not really with any film in mind, just because they were doing things that he found fascinating that he couldn't. It just became an extension of his photos, but his photos were always the thing he was focused on. And then he came to Grain with just hundreds of hours worth of footage. Also, he didn't speak the language, so he wasn't following conversations. And there wasn't a story, and I think he'd admit that, although he's very into film. And he learned a huge amount in the edit. And it was the best experience, I'd say, in my career, and the hardest. But I love that film so much. And yes, and it was definitely made in the edit suite.
Bruce Lee. Care Bruce Lee? Normal sau Bruce Lee aurul ăla?
Sunt trimis de Domnul. Eu am un mesaj de transmis lumii. Eu, boss de boss.
A încercat să facă o casă pentru noi. Un copil ca toți copiii. Decât că mie nu mi-a întins Dumnezeu o mână că are alți copii.
So we're talking here about Bruce Lee and the Outlaw, the film directed by Joost van der Broek, as you were just saying there. And this is the film that I saw, and we started chatting about it on Twitter, about this sort of underworld of Bucharest. And it's interesting because I watched it with my girlfriend who's Romanian. So she was sort of telling me about, these kids and where they existed and where they come from. They sort of were turfed out of the orphanages in the post-Ceausescu era.
Well, the generation before. So Bruce Lee was in those orphanages, the horrendous ones in the 90s. And then the other kids, there is an orphanage that they go and stay at, but it's horrendous. And there's, drug addiction is rife and abuse. And now Nico, I mean, he's an adult now, but for a time when he was living with Raluca, who's a woman who Joost and Raluca took the kids off the streets, and he was much safer than in the orphanage, actually.
Yeah.
But then amazing footage of these underground, I mean, I was going to say caves, like caverns, or it's the old sort of sewerage works and
not sewerage, it was I think Ceausescu, hot water pipes.
Pipes, yeah, that's right.
That go under the city. I mean, they're amazing. They're boiling hot. So it's a good place to sleep.
Absolutely. And they'd sort of turned it into their own kind of underworld city, in a sense. And this guy who calls himself Bruce Lee with this sort of charismatic Pied Piper sort of thing going on, you know what I mean? But especially for these young kids. But yeah, I mean, it's a really, really tough watch. So the main question I wanted to ask was, how much were you and Joost sort of thinking about how bleak do we need to make this? Because we can't sort of shy away from how difficult it is. Well, all these young kids on drugs, with their little bags of this Aralac. It must be quite difficult to sort of, in your mind, to sort of think, how can we keep the audience, on board and have a central story that may have hopefully some kind of, not a resolution or a happy ending, but do you know what I mean? Something to go to, but keeping that sense of how bleak this situation is.
Well, the bleakness, actually, there's not much you have to do for that it's obvious. And actually, Joost, and I think it comes across a lot in the footage, as I was watching the footage, that Joost was very keen to show that these kids had a lot of fun. that they're very resilient, but they were just kids, and they were doing what kids do, which is, playing and having a laugh. And I mean, I used to be in the edit suite and laughing about something that the kids were doing, and someone would walk in and I think if you just saw it from the outside, people were going, God, how could you watch this? And I couldn't see it because I got to know those kids.
Yeah.
And then obviously when Nico got ill, that footage was the most painful footage. So going back to when Joost turned up with this footage, I watched it through with a translator and with Joost to try and find whether there was a feature film in there. And I said, yes, there is, not really knowing how the hell we were going to make a feature film out of it. And then, he'd interviewed all the kids. He'd spent years with them. So there was incredible interviews, and with Bruce Lee. And I think people thought Bruce Lee would be the main character. But this little kid, Nico, was so incredible. And there's so much footage of him just telling amazing stories. He's the best storyteller and so sweet. And I think he came out as a clear voice, and then he got ill. So obviously there was this event that happened to him, which actually, I was talking about this the other day, that their day-to-day lives were not much happened to them.
Sure.
And they're often very stoned from the punga. So actually for any plot, it was hard to find any plot. And Joost happened to be there when he found Nico very close to death and got him to the hospital. And he filmed a bit on his phone, very little, because he was in the hospital and couldn't, but enough to make that a key part of the story. And so then I thought we need to impose some story structure on this. And it was a classic coming of age movie, potentially. So Joost would go back and record more voiceover with Nico and show him scenes that we've cut, which are my favourite bits, where he's commentating on the scenes. And then we had his 18th birthday. We knew that was coming up, so that could be a nice end to the film. Whatever may happen to him, at least he's become an adult and he's moved away from Bruce. But then Bruce got arrested as well, which was even more perfect. I mean, not for Bruce, it was very, very sad. But from a coming of age point of view, it coincided with Nico's 18th birthday. And yeah.
I mean, would you say it's the most experimental film you've made in a way? Because what you're talking about in terms of imparting a kind of narrative on that, there's still long sections, isn't there, where it literally is sort of more concerned with the aesthetics of being in underground and all that kind of stuff, and what it actually feels like to be in that situation,
Well, that's definitely Joost. So I'm all for, I was trying desperately to fit it into this as much as I could, to have a structure that audiences could follow. And then, but the snow, I don't know if you remember, there are episodes where they're walking through the snow. And it was beautiful footage, and this very dreamlike footage. And they're often stoned. So going into their world is probably a bit like that. That's what we were trying to imagine. But that's very much Joost. That's him bringing his aesthetic to it, but then finding a place for that within a story. Yeah, and we had more of those. I really love those sequences. We did have more of those, but probably too many. So it was getting the balance right, that you weren't lost. You didn't feel like you'd been left hanging as an audience.
And then I just watched this morning, actually, the short doc you did for National Geographic on the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. And it's funny because I think there's a lot of, obviously it's a different part of the world and a different story, but it kind of is similar, isn't it, in a way, in terms of the situations, the stuff that's going on. So how did you get involved with that project? Tell us about that one.
So that was at Grain with Orlando von Einsdale. And actually there's 5 films we've done for Nat Geo, and the other 4 are being released this week.
All right.
And they're great. They're all very different from all parts of the world, but Orlando's big thing, which I love, is trying to find stories of hope in really desperate situations. And the Lost and Found was about this incredible man, Kamal Hussein, reunites families in the biggest refugee camp on earth in Bangladesh, and he's amazing. He's a Rohingya refugee himself, and he's lived there for many years, and he's just found this purpose in life. And so the film crew were there following him, and he just got on with his job and was very unself-conscious, which was perfect. And talking about that emotional thing in interviews, he's very unemotional in his interview, but he's so open, and I just think he's so relatable that those interviews were beautiful. He didn't say very much because he's really busy. And he's doing his job and he's just getting on with it. But what he does say is very moving. Yeah,
it's interesting because as a character, it's almost like somebody without any guile or sort of any agenda. He's just doing it. He's just doing what he's got to do in finding these kids, and just goes into these situations. And you can see that the manner, he seems very somebody who can win trust very easily, and that comes across in the film.
Absolutely. God, the kids, you see them totally relaxed with him.
Yeah.
He's so good with them, and he's very matter of fact. He doesn't fuss around them. He just does his job and finds their parents, and it's very beautiful. I mean, there's so many more rushes, so many more kids he reunited with parents, and we had to make decisions because it could have felt very episodic because they're quite similar. He stays with the kids, he announces it, and then the parents come and they get reunited. So we had to mix it up and choose which kids represented certain things. But there were so many more, and it was incredible to watch the footage for that. But the same with Nico, sorry.
Okay.
But the guile, and the same with Nico, that Nico's the little boy in Bruce Lee and the Outlaw. He has lived through unbelievably awful things. And I guess it's because he's a child and now he's in his early 20s, but he doesn't seem to have any resentment about him, which, I think that's really surprising. And I wouldn't blame him if he did have lots of resentment about how his life's turned out. But he made a brilliant character in that respect. And once we decided to use him as voiceover and show this film from his point of view, we couldn't go any other way. We just had to, if he talked about, we'd ask him about Ceausescu. He knew nothing about Ceausescu. So we couldn't go down that route. We couldn't make it political because Nico's not particularly political. What we did do was use a bit of archive just to give you a bit of background, but very little, minimal.
So just a final question now. It must be actually quite satisfying looking at the kind of work you get involved with, which has a political significance, and hopefully enough if enough people see it, and it's situated on the channels like National Geographic or Netflix, in the places where we always ask this question: does film matter anymore? But the work that you're working on definitely does have that aim, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been really lucky to have been involved with Orlando and Grain. But yes, I've seen Virunga change that part of the world, but made a massive difference to the lives of lots of people. And I mean, I've learned from Orlando that finding stories of hope is how you engage audiences, and also telling stories. If you've got an engaging story, you'll get a bigger audience and you'll have more of an impact. And I'm incredibly lucky to have worked on films that do make a difference. And I think, good documentary really can make a difference.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed looking at your work over the last week or so. So thanks so much again for taking the time out to come on The Cinematologist.
Thank you so much.
Le parc national de Virunga, c'est la vie de la communauté. C'est dans cette entité là où vous pouvez encore trouver les gorilles des montagnes. C'est ça ma vie. Ils ont l'amour.
I think that we have a problem.
So thanks so much to Katie for taking the time out, especially when, I know she was very busy working from home, as she mentioned there. So Neil, we'll have a talk about some of the things that Katie said there, but you've seen Bruce Lee in The Outlaw, and you saw Maiden as well, and I just wondered if we can look at those from an editing perspective, how does that make the films that they are?
Yeah, I watched Bruce Lee in The Outlaw and Maiden. I also saw Virunga as well. And in each case, I felt I was in the kind of the presence of an editor who knew how to tell the particular story. I think Katie's a really good editor and able in all those cases to see the best way to present that material. And I think that they're all kind of really well judged. I thought Maiden was fantastic, and I liked Virunga, and I thought Bruce Lee was fantastic as well. And they were all very different films, but there was just a kind of confidence of kind of pacing and structure and kind of storytelling that felt really significant. What I loved about Bruce Lee in The Outlaw was how uncomfortable it made me feel physically, and how so much of the footage is kind of underground in these tunnels under Bucharest, where these hundreds and hundreds of, a lot of them young kids. The decision to cut the material in that post 9/11 Gulf War, handheld, really, really fast, really kinetic, really disorientating, really made the experience kind of visceral. And the amount of kind of time spent in that environment meant that whatever the characters were saying, that the reality of their existence was felt. And I thought that was a really bold and kind of rewarding decision. But also a decision which you can sort of see why that film might not necessarily play in the same way that a film like Maiden would, because it's unflinching. You can't avoid the reality. There's very little kind of that's kind of superficial distancing or anything else. It's really, it's a really difficult and kind of challenging piece of work.
And the difference is as well, there's not an easy story to tell that has light at the end of the tunnel, say that Maiden has. No. You know what I mean? There's always that sense of, they're going to succeed. Even if they don't win the race, they're still succeeding. Yeah. Especially right now, it's sort of within a context that you can frame it really easily. Whereas I think, obviously, with Bruce Lee and The Outlaw, there's a historical context that you kind of, unless you know about it, it's difficult to sort of place. But then also, there's a sort of realization that this is, especially with the focus on Nico, the one kid. But there's a sense in which there's 1,000, 10,000 stories that are just as horrific, and what's the answer to that? You know what I mean?
And the editing doesn't make you feel informed in the way that that when we're following Nico around in different parts of his experience, there's not a lot of title cards or kind of you just have to go with him and be sort of taken around. And it's a very, very different film to Maiden and Virunga, which both feel like they're kind of tapping into what might be, in a very generalist sort of sense, kind of narrative techniques in terms of storytelling. This kind of these kind of arcs of introducing characters, introducing conflict, introducing a kind of goal, and then building to this kind of climax. But what's brilliant about the handling of both is that the editing is aware that although there's a kind of a narrative arc that can be kind of pinned to the story, it's a real story, and that sense of, particularly in the final acts of both films, of not knowing what's going to happen. And I didn't know the story of Maiden, and I purposely didn't read anything beforehand, not being a yachting aficionado. So it unravels like a drama, and the handling of it is really, really beautifully played in terms of the storytelling. And Virunga as well is kind of set in this place where it's so, it kind of builds to a huge kind of Civil War conflict right in amongst all these people who you've been following through the film, and you literally don't know whether they're going to come out alive. You just know it's real, and there's a real honesty and integrity to the editing, which reminds you that while it might be cinematically moving you towards the conclusion of the story, that these are very much real people's lives. And it felt like there's a lot of choices in both films which are kind of really grounding in terms of reminding that these characters are people in a real situation, and it's not a dramatic retelling. It's actually a kind of cinematic assembling of real footage, documentary footage. Really enjoyable, and really impressive body of work from Katie.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was interesting in the interview was she talked about confidence a lot, and I didn't, start out in that direction, but she kept sort of coming back to it, especially when we were talking about her developing, through university. And it's interesting, I think, when you think of the experience we have in teaching students and the dynamics of which kinds of students go into which roles or assume that they belong in a certain role. And it's fascinating. We've got some examples that we'll talk about later on about how many great female editors there are. But it was really interesting to hear her listen to the sort of development of her confidence in terms of working on projects and gaining a greater sense of what the editing craft is beyond just training on technology. And it's interesting how I think sort of people who are at the top of their field, they master the technical elements of it, but it's the way that transcends into the art form, let's say, within the art form, so the editing within the film. And it was fascinating to hear her talking about that.
Yeah, it definitely brought up a lot of feels, as the kids say, in terms of kind of teaching and that university space, because one of the kind of the challenging things is trying to, particularly female students, trying to help them see that there's no role that shouldn't be by rights something that they can do or want to do, but there's something about the experience of university on a film course, no matter how much you say the opposite, that ends up pushing female students into editing. We a lot of our female students, third year editors are female students who've ended up doing it because like a lack of confidence or feeling like they're able to say, I want to be a cinematographer or I want to be a director. And without being too general, there's a lot of 18-year-old boys who come in very, very confident that they can already do that. And they make that clear in classrooms that they are directors or that they are cinematographers. And they take up that space, and that kind of leaves fewer options. And we have really good editors and a lot of graduates who've gone on to be, successful in the industry and working their way up in post-production, who kind of fell in love with editing but weren't necessarily sure. They didn't know what they wanted to do when they arrived, but felt that was a space where they could be left alone, which I think is kind of sad in one sense, and also not necessarily helped by editing being traditionally one of the areas which has a really large array of the best, or the so-called best and canonical practitioners being female. There's a really, really good percentage of editors across film history who are female. So it's one of those roles, if you're a young person and you're looking for, even a university, where are the examples? Where's the visibility of gender in the role? There's a lot of editors who you can call on, but in the same way there aren't that many cinematographers, if hardly any. So that doesn't always help, in the sense that it makes people feel comfortable. I can do editing because there's a lot of women who've done it historically, and while that's true and they're great editors, it doesn't always solve the other problems that are part of kind of trying to use university as a space to address those historical inequities in terms of the amount of people doing certain roles, or feeling confident that, not that they can do it when they leave, because no one really can, but that's the path they want to pursue, which kind of leads me to the next point, which is that it's really great to hear someone kind of showing a really good understanding of how long it takes to get good. and what it takes to get good, which is, being interested and feeling like you want to do something is literally the start. You lent me you bought me a great book by Richard Russo, the writer, about with lots of essays about writing, and one of them is called Getting Good, and it's about that once you know this is what you want to do, the commitment to doing it takes a long time. And this has been great to see, and all those films that we're talking about, you can sort of see the Virunga and Maiden and Bruce Lee and the Outlaw are examples of an editor who's become good and is in command of what they're doing and their craft. And that's, that's what I like to see as a film fan is being in the presence of people who can do that craft really well.
But it's interesting when she said, talking about her formative years and editing lots of student short films and then going into kids TV. And I mean, she says it there. I was the premier editor for children's television at one point. And you can imagine that being just sort of like because you're talking about the storytelling, and she obviously in the interview sort of put storytelling at the forefront of what's important to her editing technique. But the idea of editing something together that a 6-year-old can understand, of course that's going to give you, a lot of skills in being able to sort of understand how the formal aspects of storytelling works. But then, moving into Holby City, as she talks about, where things are blocked out, and you have to match then the storytelling to the way in which the script has been written. So you can just see that somebody has gone through these different iterations and different types of filmmaking, in the broadest sense of that term, to get to a point where you're making something quite experimental with Bruce Lee and the Outlaw, and at times sort of, letting the camera not maybe cutting as quickly as you would ordinarily do, because you want to get that sense of being inside the caves and get that claustrophobia. So you can see where someone's building up of their abilities has come from through these different forms of editing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that someone who's spent a lot of time doing things which are rote or pushing buttons, in the Holby example, and has got a vast array of experience on a lot of different kind of genres and different forms. But when the quote unquote opportunity comes to actually do some editing, they're not falling back on just doing it by the numbers. Bruce Lee is a really, really interestingly edited piece of work, which could be edited a different way, and in the hands of a lot of people who might have come through the same processes and the same experiences that kind of Katie's gone through would kind of just fall back on easier techniques. And that's what's kind of interesting about it, is that despite going through all of that apprenticeship, which so many people have to go through, coming out the other side and using the skills in a more kind of artisanal and kind of craft driven way is really, really exciting, I think.
Awesome. So tell me about then some of the examples that you were thinking of when I said, what comes to mind when you think of a film that is defined maybe or is represented as being great because of its editing?
So I mentioned one earlier, which Don't Look Now, Nicholas Rogue, edited by Graham Clifford. And yeah, just it's one of those ones, it feels too obvious, but I've used it a lot in teaching, and every time you use it, it just kind of it just feels like the perfect example of how to think about time and the use of time and the manipulation of time, and that opening sequence is just extraordinary, and the whole tone of the film is set up in that sequence, which the editing of it is just absolutely incredible. And it was interesting that Graham Clifford also edited The Man Who Fell to Earth for Rogue, Altman's Images, a similar psychological thriller from the early 70s, in that kind of period of British cinema or British filmmakers kind of, in that European new wave, really leaning into time and space manipulation on screen. I think that was a great example. And the other two I wanted to mention were mainly because I've been watching the Wu-Tang documentary, but Ghost Dog, Jay Rabinowitz's editing on Ghost Dog, which is just a wonderful example of working with music to pace a film and to just kind of to create the sense of being sort of taken along by the sound and the image concurrently. I just think I love the score, and the editing feels absolutely connected to it in such a holistic and organic way, that it just feels so natural. I like editing where you just feel like everything's kind of unraveling before you in the way it should. And the last one is Sarah Flack's editing for the Limey. She's an editor who is kind of Sofia Coppola's regular editor, and I also saw she edited Dave Chappelle's Block Party, which is one of my favourite music documentaries. But Stephen Soderbergh's The Limey is one of my favourite films, and it does that thing which Don't Look Now does in terms of the way it plays with the past and the present and the future, and kind of creates a simultaneously disorienting but also a disorienting experience, but simultaneously makes you feel like, you know, you're exactly where you should be in the story and the kind of the timeline. It's just kind of really magical, kind of dreamlike editing. And also it's a film which is both, you know, kind of edited in the present in terms of the story it's unraveling, but also uses archive footage from Ken Loach's Poor Cow in such an amazing way. The way that it weaves that footage in to be sort of Terence Stamp and sort of Leslie Moran's kind of younger characters, younger selves, is just magical. It just feels like a masterclass in kind of so many different forms of editing, and I just love it. I just love the way it's kind of cool and pulpy and just kind of dreamlike. I think it's an exceptional piece of work, and another sort of film I bring out a lot when I'm teaching editing. What about you?
Well, two of the editors that immediately sprung to mind were women, and I think that what I was thinking of was what we talked a little bit about earlier on in terms of the way in which the editor is kind of subsumed under the auteur. And there's two classic examples of that for me, and one is Thelma Schoonmaker, who is Scorsese's regular editor. And I always remember, and I think it was Mark Cousins years ago told me this. So, and I hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn here, but I think there was one particular film. Obviously, the relationship between Schoonmaker and Scorsese is absolutely fundamental to the filmmaking, and just evidence though that, you know, the auteur male always takes the sort of top billing. But I think Mark sort of intimated to me that with Casino, his film, that she ostensibly saved that in the edit because he had all the footage but didn't know really how to put it together. And again, you know, I think some of these could be urban legends, but it's interesting how I think, you know, that could be circulated as a sort of open secret in Hollywood, the idea that, you know, that Schoonmaker does do a lot of the work of putting the films together in the right way, let's say. And then the other one was Françoise Colline, who is the editor for Godard. And for somebody who is, you know, considered by, you know, many as sort of transformative of cinema from sort of, you know, a classical to a modern art form, really, the editing part of that is so fundamental. And it's interesting how she doesn't get mentioned very rarely, I think, in terms of the relationship between the two. It is, again, everything is the male director getting the top billing. But then also, just in terms of absolutely brilliant editing in the last few years, the film I would point to would be Mad Max Fury Road, and that's edited by Margaret Sixel. And that's a film, I think, that is just so completely requiring of you as a viewer to know where you are in space and time. That if the editing is off with that, you could just get completely lost in the images, because there's so much going on just in terms of the aesthetics and the colours and the speed of movement and everything like that. And it's so interesting how that film is, you know, is plot-wise is so basic, but yet it's just so complex in an editing sense. And I never ever feel like I do with some action movies where, well, where am I now? Who's fighting who? And it's amazing how you never really feel that in that film. And then I think, you know, the sort of other great names that you could mention, someone like Lee Smith, who's done The Truman Show, Master and Commander, so he's an Australian editor, but now works very much with Christopher Nolan and did The Dark Knight. Michael Kahn, who is Spielberg's editor, and I think particularly his work on Minority Report, I think was really, really interesting. And then Pietro Scalia, I think, I mean, going back to the use of the footage and how to construct kind of different time frames. I mean, he directed JFK, which I think is almost a sort of masterclass of that idea of, because in the courtroom scene as well, the whole film is sort of trying to construct something of, what went on in the past when you never really know, and sort of getting that idea of, we understand the kind of corners of this movie, even though it's a conspiracy movie and you're not supposed to know what's going on. And Scalia went on to work very much with Ridley Scott on Gladiator and The Martian and his other films. So those are a few of the. Oh, and I must also mention Mark Sanger, who edited Gravity and works with Alfonso Cuarón, and I think again another editor who contributes an awful lot, it seems to me, in terms of what the films actually are.
Cool. Yeah, I thought you might have mentioned Dede Allen, who edited The Hustler, Dog Day Afternoon, and Bonnie and Clyde.
Well, there's so many, isn't there? It's.
I know. I just know how much you love The Hustler. That's all. Yeah, but no, it's interesting. I think in terms of the dominance of the auteur, and also that kind of coupled with this idea of finding the film in the edit, and kind of what that role is, and what that part of the process is, and what that relationship is, and how the film comes together from the footage, which is kind of gargantuan. And Shoemaker's a great example, because imagine that career with a different filmmaker. And when we talk about the auteur theory, and I kind of sort of say you can trace Tarantino from sort of pre-Sally Menke to post-Sally Menke. Since she's died, those films are not edited in the same way, and they're arguably much more flabby, with much less control. Even the longer, earlier films that Jackie Brown is just beautifully edited and feels it doesn't feel long. It feels like the right length of time, and so if there's such a discernible difference between the editing and not just the kind of the form of the editing, but the fact that there's such a control and it feels so right. When the editor steps away, what does that say about the role of the editor? And to me, it says that the editing plays a big part. And to sort of go back to Dede Allen and kind of Bonnie and Clyde, and you think about the ending of that film and how significant that sequence is, and what the editing of that sequence particularly, which kind of arguably changes so much in cinema, and so much of it is in that kind of psycho mold, felt rather than seen. It feels violent. It feels like we're seeing something really vicious, even though a lot of what we're seeing is kind of snatched and kind of felt rather than, I think it's a brilliant piece of filmmaking and from an editing point of view. And I think that those people that we're talking about are kind of masters at kind of knowing what that storytelling needs to be from the footage, and arguably the directors are not always the best people to make those decisions, because they're close to the material, and I wouldn't say that's a general kind of blanket statement, but I think that there's a case to be made for editing as being kind of the most vital part, and a lot of filmmakers have said so. Wells was obviously very, very vocal about that editing is filmmaking, that everything else is just building up to that point where you make the film in the edit room.
Well, that seems like a good place to end. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thanks once again to Katie. It's been great to sort of have her interview as the inspiration to talk about editing in film. Great to speak to you, Neil, of course.
Yeah, thank you, and really good to catch up, and really love the episode. Thanks, Ben.
No problem. And we have one more to go. I think we'll try and get that done maybe in a week or 10 days' time. And then we'll go on our summer hiatus. If you want to catch up with us, of course, you can email us, cinematologists@gmail.com, or we're on Twitter. So if you've got any comments on this episode or any of the others, if you feel like you want to support the podcast a little bit more and gain access to our bonus material, including our newsletter, then you can go to our Patreon site. That's patreon.com/cinematologists. Thanks to everyone who continues to listen. This has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.